And we're
Well,
live.
welcome everyone to session 6 of the free online course in DML Commons, Program Evaluation for Connected Learning. This is a course where you'll learn and gain practical experience in the process of educational program evaluation by exploring some real-world problems brought forth by youth-serving programs who are case studies in our particular course. And today's guests, I'm delighted to have on board are from the National Writing Project and SRI International. The National Writing Project, or NWP, is a network of sites anchored in colleges and universities and serving teachers across disciplines and all levels from early childhood through university, focused on the improvement of writing instruction. Founded in 1974, the NWP provides professional development, develops resources, and generates research, and then acts on that research to improve the teaching of writing and learning in schools and communities. And SRI International, where I also used to work, is a research nonprofit located in Menlo Park, California. And my guest Alix today is from the Center for Education Policy there, which conducts technically rigorous education policy research at the local, state, and national levels. Center researchers there seek to identify what works to improve education and to translate the information to policymakers for their decisions about public investments in the education system from preschool through college. So, to introduce our guests here, I have Linda Friedrich from the National Writing Project, who is the Director of Research and Evaluation there. And Linda's research interests include teacher leadership and professional development, teacher research, professional learning communities, and the diffusion of knowledge and practice. Linda joined the NWP in October 2002. Prior to joining the National Writing Project, she served as a Director of Research at the Coalition for Essential Schools. Welcome, Linda. And here at SRI, I'm actually calling in from SRI today. We have Alix Gallagher, who's the Associate Director for the Center for Education Policy. She runs large-scale studies of teacher quality policies and programs using a range of methodologies, including randomized control trials, quasi-experimental designs, and mixed methods program evaluations. Gallagher has been the co-principal investigators of 5 different randomized control trials designed to estimate the impacts of interventions on teacher practices and student outcomes. She leads studies on teacher preparation, professional development, and human capital management. So welcome to both of you today. Before I begin to interview them about their work, I'd like to say a little bit about conducting large-scale evaluation research and education. This is the first time we've taken up this topic in this course because we've been mostly focused on smaller programs. And so this will be a new topic, and I'm excited to introduce it to you here. A reminder to everyone who's watching too, whether live or if you're watching live, you can use the hashtag CLEval to pose questions on Twitter, and we'll try to get to them today, or use the chat feature where you're watching this live webcast. I hope you will pose questions of the guests today in this way and in future sessions that I can ask them to answer. So to get us started, I wanted to say a little bit about large-scale evaluation, because it's really very much a different ballgame from the sort that we've been talking about in this course so far. I've had the good fortune to be part of a number of large-scale randomized control trials, that is, studies that use random assignment of assigning teachers or students to a treatment group at random and another group to a comparison group. And one of the things that's really exciting about it is that you get to be part of this team effort with lots of different expertise at the table. And I've been part of some of this early stages of the work that you're going to hear about today with the National Writing Project, and it was so great to be able to work with experts in writing, professional development, in research methodology, and teacher learning, a whole range of expertise. And so one gets to learn a lot as being a contributor to those projects. As you listen today, maybe this is not your thing. It's not the resources that you have available for your program evaluation. You're not being asked to answer questions that can be answered with a randomized control trial, a large-scale one at that. But I would say that one of the things that is true about the kinds of evaluation studies you're going to hear about today is that they're really the best way to estimate the impact of a program. And this is, in fact, often what funders are interested in. They want to know what difference a program makes for teacher practice or for student learning. So when do you use a design like this? When do you use a design when you can estimate the causal impact of a program? Well, for one, when the question is about impact. In other words, when the question is worded something like, does this thing work? Is it better that they have this program versus that program? And oftentimes, questions really are of this nature. Of course, sometimes you're interested in other kinds of questions, like how can this program be implemented? Is this program, is implementing the program associated with learning gains, when we're not asking the causal question? So that's one occasion when you want to use this kind of design. A second occasion, or really condition for using this kind of design ethically, is when there's the possibility of being able to offer this treatment to somebody either through a delayed treatment kind of arrangement, or when it's oversubscribed and you have a strong belief in the program. If you really believe in the possibility that this program can bring benefit to others, then there's a sense in which you want to set up the obligation to offer it after the study is concluded, to that opportunity for others. If it's a genuine question about you're not actually sure which of these programs is better, or whether the program is really better than business as usual, then maybe you don't need to have that option. But when you believe it as the researcher, it's really important to have that up front as a condition for doing this kind of design. The other good condition in place is there have to be good measures available. If you're going to use administrative data like student test scores and you have a lot of questions about whether those are valid measures, spending a lot of money on a large-scale study with bad measures is not a good investment of evaluation resources. You might be better off delaying your big study and developing those measures and spending the resources you can to do that. So good measures are really a key condition for having a good experiment. And you're going to hear from my colleagues what good measurement work they've done over the years and how they build on the work that NWP has done here that makes their work possible. The other important condition here for this work is having the expertise and infrastructure you need available. One kind of expertise that you really need to have is you want to have evaluators who know how to implement a wide variety of different kinds of designs for different situations: experimental, quasi-experimental, dose-response kinds of designs. Lots of different kinds of designs so that you can adjust to the realities of your particular circumstances. You also need people with expertise in costing these kinds of studies. They are labor intensive, and so knowing the kinds of labor that you need and what that labor would cost, and also the kinds of incentives that you should have in place for teachers, is another form of expertise. So before undertaking that, making sure you have that. And the last thing to have is to make sure that you have a strong infrastructure for data collection and management. One is unlikely to do a large-scale study with 1 or 2 people. You're going to need a lot of people and a lot of technological infrastructure to be able to pull this off, this kind of study off. So those are some other important conditions for doing these kinds of studies. So if you can meet those conditions, there is a lot that you can learn, and 2 big things that I think are very valuable from learning from large-scale randomized controlled trials are, one, what are the barriers and supports that are needed to bring something powerful to scale. You learn a lot by studying a project in a wide variety of classrooms, because you see all the different conditions that teachers face in implementing programs and all the organizational conditions that they have to wrestle with and navigate. And in a randomized control trial, you're often providing some of the supports to help them overcome those and thereby learn a lot from it. You also have the possibility of learning what works when and for whom. A lot of focus gets focused on the impact question: does this work? But most randomized control trials are also collecting a tremendous amount of information about who's participating and also the implementation of the programs themselves. And that allows you to learn an awful lot along the way about the conditions for implementation, how implementation variation affects outcomes, and for whom the program is working. So these kinds of designs, they're really great for mature programs that are well developed. And before you do them, really ask yourself, do I have the capacity on my evaluation team to do this? And is the program ready for this thing? It's very useful, as I've said, to estimate the impact, to figure out what works. And I think, as you'll hear about today, a randomized controlled trial, an initial one, can actually lead to a whole series of study, a long-term kind of partnership between two organizations to generate knowledge that can really continue to inform program improvement. So that's all I have to say on this topic, and you're going to hear what this really looks like on the ground from Linda and Alik. So I'm going to turn now to asking them a few questions about some of their work too. And Linda, I want to start with you and ask you to tell us a little bit more about NWP, and also Mark St. John, who's going to be on here in the next session with us, has called it an improvement infrastructure. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that term in particular in reference to NWP.
Thanks, Bill. It's great to be here today. So the National Writing Project, in addition to Bill's great introduction, is really a network of local sites. We have 185 sites in all 50 states. And ever since I've been at the National Writing Project, Mark St. John and his colleagues at Inverness Research have really thought about our work as an improvement infrastructure. And so there are two dimensions of that. There's the infrastructure and there's the improvement part of it. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what we mean when we say infrastructure. And I'm going to start from the local and then sort of grow that up to the national piece. Each local writing project site is housed within a university and is typically co-led by a university researcher and a K-12 educator. And so part of the infrastructure is that our network brings the resources of both local universities and of teachers in a local community to bear. One of our key areas of work is, I think people hear the National Writing Project and they really focus on the writing aspect of that, and of course that's really important. When we think about infrastructure, we also think about building capacity, and in particular we think about building teachers' leadership capacity. We have a number of structures that do that that are pretty common across the National Writing Project network. So annually, every local writing project site has a way to bring in new teacher leaders. They identify teachers in their local area who already have some expertise in the teaching of writing. They then engage those people in three kinds of work. Doing the discipline, so teachers engage together in doing a lot of writing and responding to writing themselves. They read research and they bring a piece of their practice and learn effective ways for sharing that with their peers. And we see that initial entry experience really as an entry point into an ongoing local writing project community where those teacher leaders can continue to learn and grow. Those local writing project sites and their network of teacher leaders then look for ways to do work in their local communities. So they offer professional development for schools and districts and teachers who haven't yet been involved with the writing project. And so having that infrastructure that can both make contracts locally but also has access to a network of knowledgeable, prepared teacher leaders is really critical. And then also they reach out to youth and do some direct youth programming beyond the school day. So if you can imagine sort of these local hubs of expertise, and then we're all connected together through a national network. And I work at the national office of the National Writing Project. And so we do a number of things. First and foremost, we raise money, much of which goes back to the local community to help continue to build this local capacity, this local leadership. And we also are able to raise funds where we can focus together on particular kinds of learning project and bring learning problems, learning challenges, and bring that expertise to bear. We convene the network. We believe that there's a lot of knowledge locally and that people learn things locally that are important important to be shared across the network. We do research, both of the kind that you'll be hearing about today, but then we're also involved in pretty groundbreaking research on teacher leadership. We're very involved in thinking about writing in the digital age, which is not something that's sort of right now in that experimental design space, but is really very much about thinking about new strategies for communication. How do we use all of these digital tools to support learning? And we can disseminate knowledge to both our own network, but then we also maintain connections with other organizations. And the improvement part really is focused on these different kinds of questions that emerge around writing, the teaching of writing, teacher learning. So I'll pause there, Bill.
Great. And speaking of sort of the research role, I assume so research and evaluation plays a role in that, your internal research and also the work that you've done with SRI. And at this point, you've undertaken a few studies together. But I'm wondering, Linda, if you can tell us, a little bit about what motivated the first of those studies, and how are the concerns and motivations maybe a little bit different today too? How have they evolved?
Great. So our work with SRI began not long after we first built an internal research and development perspective. And we started our internal research unit back in 2002. And that was at the time when the National Research Council had just come out with their report on the importance of experimental research and improvement research in education. So we, at that point, were really at a point where we had a lot of anecdotal evidence, and we had a lot of knowledge from teachers directly through the kinds of work that they brought into their leadership work about impacts that they were seeing on their own students. But the policy landscape had really changed, where that kind of evidence wasn't enough. And so we really came into our partnership with SRI with the question of what can we come to understand about whether the kinds of work, the kinds of professional learning that the National Writing Project offers, whether that ultimately has an impact on student writing. And our network is incredibly diverse. That work came out of a series of local studies that were quasi-experiments that looked pretty narrowly at some smaller studies, but those weren't big enough to really be able to make claims about the national network. So that was really the initial motivation. And I would say that our ongoing work actually has similar motivations. If anything, the demands in the policy space and in competitions for major federal funding has intensified. Now for large federal implementation grants, especially from the Department of Ed, but increasingly in other federal funding areas as well, there's a requirement both to demonstrate impact on students using experimental design methods, and then also to conduct evaluations of new work to help grow that research base.
And do you think that early work then stead you well for your competitiveness today to win grants?
Absolutely. I think that the network as a whole has been engaged in more of this kind of work. There's more of an understanding of what the contributions can be. We also learned a tremendous amount from those earlier studies about what's the right slice of intervention to look at nationally using these methods. And I think that we've learned a lot about how to support sites in moving from work where teachers have an excellent learning experience to really focusing on helping teachers take pretty complex teaching practices into their classrooms and working with with the local policy environment to make a space for those, and then what that means for students. And I think it also helped us, you talked about the importance of having well-developed measurement tools. I think that our series of work together has actually also helped us further refine the measurement around writing and to focus and target that.
Yeah, it strikes me that in great evaluation projects, you're doing good measurement work and good evaluation work simultaneously, and they really feed forward into one another and help each other out over time.
Exactly.
Alix, I know in first working with NWP, you and I started kind of at the same time working with them, and at that time they were very strongly, and I think still do, emphasize local customization of professional development for teachers to align to teachers' needs. And I'm wondering if you could speak to how this squares with the needs to evaluate impacts of the program, and if you could just speak to how SRI and NWP have sought to work together to design evaluations that have, on the one hand, integrity to this approach and philosophy, while also really trying to look at specific outcomes for teachers and students.
Sure, and just to start by saying I'm also delighted to be part of this conversation, and you've hit on something that's very important in designing these types of studies, which is that you have to have an outcome measure that is closely aligned to the goals of the program. For example, if you have an intervention that's focused on teaching students geometry, and the measure you're using at the other end of it is a test of all mathematics, there may only be a couple of questions on the test that are relevant to your work. And which is a simple example of the importance of alignment. The challenge for these types of studies when programs are customized locally is that if there's too much variation in the goals that they're working towards, it's really hard to find a measure that is sensitive, in other words, can detect the impacts that happen for teachers in their practice and therefore students. On the other hand, I think it's very important you're trying to test a program, and if a fundamental aspect of the program and the way it works is that it can be locally customized, it doesn't work as an evaluation if you get rid of that. And in fact, there's also research to suggest that customization always happens. Teachers are not empty vessels. They understand programs. They make decisions about taking them up. And an approach to developing programs that sees that as an advantage and tries to work with teachers to help them make good decisions might in fact be a more viable approach to scaling a program over many places and in a way that it is effective consistently. So I think the challenge here is finding the right balance. And I think Linda referred to this as well. Over time, the National Writing Project has really worked to very clearly articulate some explicit guidelines for what the program should look like in different places. More recently, actually developing resources which help with some of that consistency while continuing to maintain their long-standing philosophy that teachers are active agents and the importance of, as Linda said, the importance of local knowledge. And so keeping true to this idea that they are not a scripted program, we've worked really hard to have outcome measures that are aligned to those program goals, recognizing that there will be some variation and in fact should be some variation for this program and how it's delivered locally. So I think it's a balance.
So you both mentioned having to tweak or adjust measures. I wonder if there's a story you can tell of some refinement that you had to make on the measures side of things, something that maybe didn't quite work out as well, or something you even overhauled over the course of these several years now working together.
I think the example we should talk about is probably the analytic writing continuum and how that has, the work with that has evolved as the programs we're studying have evolved. And I think I can probably give a quick overview, and Linda's worked a lot on the actual tweaks, and she's probably better to talk about those. So most broadly, the first randomized controlled trial we did with the National Writing Project was of a program that was quite wide open in terms of program goals. And the basic logic of the program was that sites should go out and find schools serving middle grades that wanted to work on writing, and they'd work together for 3 years. And at the end of it, student writing would be better. And sites did lots of different things, and they focused, they delivered dramatically different programs, which was within the guidelines, but actually didn't work very well with this type of design. We would have been much better suited in terms of actually understanding the efficacy of what each site did if we had done 22 individual evaluations of partnerships. But instead, we had, sitting at the other end of a randomized controlled trial, a very broad measure of writing instruction. And I think I would say that we didn't learn very much from looking at whether or not those programs impacted that measure, because that measure was not particularly sensitive to the variation in what different sites did. As our work has evolved, the program we've been studying more recently and that we're now sharing pretty broadly is a study that focused specifically on argument writing, and increasingly honed in on this idea of helping students learn how to read complex nonfiction texts on a topic that is a debatable topic. For example, the issue that's pretty widely known right now around orcas in SeaWorld. Is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? And having students read nonfiction texts that provide information and come to their own decision, and then make an argument for their new belief using evidence from the text to support it. And for probably everyone watching this right now, this type of argument, as you know, is kind of the coin of the realm in academic discourse, is also really important in almost every professional situation and for civic engagement. It's fundamental to our governance process that people be able to look at facts, come up with their own critical thinking about those facts, and then support it with evidence. And so the measure, the analytic writing continuum that's used in the first evaluation, was substantially adapted to really focus on the specifics of what the general, they're called attributes. The attributes have remained the same, but the tool has been modified to help scorers be able to take a look at a piece of student writing and look specifically at the nature of that, how that writing should look, given that it is an argument based on sources. And Linda, I'll let you talk a bit more about the modifications in a bit more detail, because I think they're pretty important.
So one of the things that this current project really allowed us to do is to make the kinds of modifications to the analytic writing continuum. And we've been working for about the past decade with a group of writing assessment experts to have an ongoing development of this tool. So we have quite a lot of data and well-honed practices around preparing scorers to score. But our original analytic writing continuum was originally based on 6+1 traits. And I think it aspired to be able to see positive writing qualities across a wide range of writing. As we really began to look at student writing that was based on sources, it raised a number of issues around, especially around the content attribute, around what makes for a good piece of writing. So it was possible with the original analytic writing continuum to look at something where students actually basically ignored the source material and wrote an argument based on their personal experience, which could be a great and a good thing. I am a deep believer in young people bringing their personal experience into writing. However, the program was really focused on building young people's capacities for reading a broad range of perspectives, deciding where they stood on an issue, and then carefully selecting evidence and using that evidence to put forward their own argument. And what we realized as we were working on this project is that the way we had defined content really didn't take that into consideration. Once students start working with sources, it also raises a lot of concerns for teachers about, did the students basically copy what was on the written page? So there were some real issues raised by the type of writing that we did that needed different descriptors and needed some different kinds of preparations for scorers to help them see the specific qualities. So we were very concerned about making sure that the scorers would look at young people's reasoning. And look at how they were selecting evidence, and then how they connected that evidence back to the point that they were making. And those are all complex moves, especially for 7th through 10th graders. And it's been a while since teachers have really been teaching that kind of writing. So we were also creating a vision for the teachers who would be scoring the writing of what makes a good piece of source-based argument writing.
It's a great example. So you've already started to talk a little bit about this new recently concluded evaluation study that you've done, and Alik's mentioned that it's much more focused, and Linda, you just talked about providing some teacher resources that are specific to it. How did this square with the local writing projects? How did you convince teachers who have been part of the NWP to sign on to something that's this focused? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so from the beginning, and Alik should definitely speak to this from the evaluation viewpoint, but from the beginning we had a very focused program. We knew that we would focus on source-based argument writing. We laid out the parameters of the amount of professional development. And pretty quickly, both from our own observations and from some of the qualitative data, it became clear that sites, the local writing project sites and the local teacher leaders were learning about argument too. This is sort of a newer piece in the writing policy landscape. And so we always work with a national leadership team. So we had a national leadership team comprised of teacher leaders. And as we saw the program in its early phases of implementation, we could see that there was a bit of distance between everybody's aspirations wanting to make a difference for teachers and students and the tools that we all currently had available to meet some of those questions. And so as we looked at things, we realized that it would take a long time to first deeply engage teachers in learning to be argument writers themselves and then bring things into the classroom. So through national convenings, we were able to share some really great resources. And one of the things that happened quickly is the teacher leaders in the local writing project sites tried on and tried out in their own classrooms these resources. And they could see that actually these materials were things that were making a difference for their own students. And that they could see how this would be valuable, especially working with teachers who maybe didn't have that rich base of writing instruction in their backgrounds. And we had teacher leaders who created and tested out the materials before they even shared them nationally.
Yeah, I would just add from an evaluation, from the evaluation data on the qualitative side, we did. This is jumping into the design a bit, but we did site visits to all of the districts that were randomly assigned to do the College Ready Writers program, as well as some qualitative data in those that were in the delayed start condition. And we found some variation. I mean, I think I would say some sites were hungry for these new materials and recognized very quickly that these materials could help them really get into teachers' classrooms and start helping teachers shift their instruction quickly. But there were other sites that took that were unaccustomed to suddenly having materials that were developed even by other, kind of centrally, but within their own network, and some, really paused. and said, well, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to look at these as models, and we're going to develop something similar, but it's really important to us that it be organic, and we do it. And others, I think I would say, just took their time a bit more. Ultimately, it was very interesting for us to see that even some of the sites that initially were more hesitant, when they saw teachers using the materials and started to see the extent to which the materials could really accelerate the shifts in instruction that teachers were trying to make, I think they became very much more positive about the materials and this whole approach. And I would say, as an evaluator, I think it's a really powerful move for programming and for professional development, because research on professional development has definitely trying to figure out the right way to say this nicely, a whole lot of research on professional development shows with these types of studies that there really are not impacts on teacher instructional practice in a short amount of time. If they are, they're more minor procedural types of changes, and therefore it is not uncommon to see no impacts on students from professional development programs. And what we think we saw with this program is that there was a really nice support between the ideas and strategies presented in professional development, the curricular resources that teachers could use to quickly try them out and get them into their classrooms while getting ongoing coaching or demonstration lessons or co-planning on how to use them, and a formative assessment tool that helped teachers to see evidence in their student writing of what the students were learning about how to do this type of work, and that then fed back into the professional development. And I think the way those three components supported each other was powerful. And we saw that as evaluators as we were going into classrooms, and I think in the various local writing project sites saw it themselves anecdotally as they were using them with teachers, just the great acceleration of instructional change. And I think that probably changed people's attitudes. It's one of those cases where actions change first and then beliefs follow.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure that that's that unusual, Elise.
I don't think
I've seen
it
it
either.
too in professional development. But it
Yeah.
strikes me too, as you're saying, you know, a lot of professional development studies don't find a positive impact. What is it that you think? You've talked about some of the substance of that. You know, there's some characteristics of the intervention. Are there other aspects of how you all work together, or how the evaluation in particular feeds into the professional development that you think helps make this more effective than a lot of professional development, say?
Yeah. Well, I can say what we hope, what we aspire to, and Linda can comment on whether we achieve that. You know, I think one of the things that draws me to SRI and makes me want to stay here is that we really care that our research both helps build the broader knowledge base, but is also immediately useful and relevant to the various people we're doing research for, the various organizations. And so that's why, you know, a randomized controlled trial at its simplest, the requirement is that you have a known program, that you randomly assign some people to get it and not others, and then you measure an outcome. And that can be all quantitative, and there can be no data collected on what happened in between the assignment and the outcome. And we've really steered away from those types of studies because we think that there are some very important questions about program implementation, about how that varies, that don't go away just because you're trying to figure out kind of did it quote unquote work. And so we built in a lot of qualitative data as well as quantitative data for us to see and to ask teachers about what things they were taking up, what types of practices they were changing, what things were difficult for them to do, and to get a sense in you know, it was a 2-year program, and to get a sense starting pretty early on, in some cases in the fall of the first year, actually get out and visit districts that were using the program. And after every data collection, we and our partners at Inverness, who worked with us on the qualitative data collection and analysis, would meet with the NWP and do just a kind of formative debriefing about, hey, here's what we think we're seeing. Sometimes it was a really rapid turnaround. So even in cases where we hadn't yet done the full-scale systematic qualitative analysis, it was more, you know, a very quick, hopefully actionable here's what we think we're seeing. You know, we can't tell you definitively, but here's some information to feed back into your thoughts. And Linda can also talk a bit about the work they did, because I think they got triangulation through their own work about what was going on in the 22 districts that I think together were probably much more powerful than either would have been on their own.
So I would say that first that those briefings were really powerful for us and often named things in a way and helped us prioritize some of the things that we saw and that we were working on. So some of the things that I think that the independent evaluators were able to surface in ways that we didn't quite have the capacity to were really some of the dynamics with the administrators. We had some insights into that, but that was really helpful. And then also seeing what teachers were taking up in their classrooms and what they were not. The way that we structured this project, I referred earlier to the national leadership team, and so we had 5 leaders from the Writing Project Network and then 3 of us who are pretty senior staff members working on this. We had monthly check-in calls with every one of the Writing Project sites to see how things were going. We visited at least once a year, and so we really, and then we also had 2 national meetings, and we sort of sat with the sites where we had primary what we call thinking partner responsibility, and we brought both Writing Project site folks and district folks. So we had a lot of ways in to understand what was happening, and we could really see from those interactions, plus coupled with what SRI and Inverness were finding in the qualitative data. And early on we could see people aren't yet focusing on source-based argument writing. People are spending a lot of time focusing on reading sources, but not so much writing about the sources. So together we really could see some of the things that we thought we had planned, or we had hoped that everybody would analyze student work. We could see from the data that were collected that that was happening in a few places, but not happening in others. And so we really thought about some strategies that could help us realize the dimensions of the program that we thought would be really important in order to see both teacher and student outcomes.
So what did you do? Presumably you've already had your big professional development event bringing people together. How was the PD structured so that you could actually implement some of the recommendations or or address some of the concerns you were raising?
So the professional development was really offered locally. So nationally, we did very little professional development. We convened local Writing Project site leaders. So for the argument focus, we could see from the initial plans that that was a place where sites would need support. We did a 7-series webinar series that engaged Writing Project site leaders in doing that. We had both summer and January partnership meetings, so we were able to support some content there. And then we also really built in online learning experiences, some of which were really primarily focused at the local Writing Project leaders, but some of which were also things that they could directly use with the teachers. And we really used those national convenings to introduce new materials. We had regular calls with Writing Project site leaders, and the professional development was ongoing throughout the year. And no one really came in with a very fixed plan. So there were a number of hours, there were dates, so there was actually quite a bit of flexibility built into the design from the beginning that allowed to bring in new tools and resources.
So that's one of the ways that you really maintained integrity to that NWP model.
Exactly, exactly.
So you talk about relying, Linda, on the local network of sites for implementing the PD, and you also, I know, rely very heavily on that infrastructure that you all have built for generating outcome data. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that, because I think really helps people get a sense of what it would mean to evaluate a project that's trying to improve writing.
Right.
The sheer volume, the size of that infrastructure that might be needed.
Right, and I should just say that SRI also brought its infrastructure to bear on the collection of the writing.
So both teams should talk a little bit about this.
Exactly. So one of the things that people may know in the policy landscape is writing is very expensive to assess. It is not assessed in every grade. It is not assessed in every state. At the beginning of this project, we had some hope that perhaps many states would be involved in the two assessment consortia, and they would have some pretty well thought through writing assessments, but we knew that that was in flux. In fact, many states have withdrawn from those assessment consortia. So we are, I would say today, about as far away from having writing assessment readily available. So there are a few things that we've done. We've invested in this group of experts in writing assessment to work with us on the development and ongoing development of writing tools. We also have relied extensively on the fact that we have a writing project network where we can recruit teachers of writing at specific grade levels to be able to come together and score writing. And I would say that we've also relied on our knowledge about how teachers learn to design practices for preparing scorers to score that, while they're not completely different from other large-scale assessments, I would say that in some ways they're more generous. Testing companies have to hit a certain percentage of reliability, and if somebody is struggling, they're going to remove those scores pretty quickly. So I think that some of the structures that we've been able to really build on our deep beliefs about teachers and teachers really being able to learn. That isn't to say that we haven't had some scorers who we've given other meaningful work to during scoring events, but by and large that's pretty rare. So we really have that infrastructure, having a national office, having connections to experts, and then being able to write to site directors and say, please send us names of 5 teachers, and have them fill out a survey, and then selecting from that pool to get teachers who have experience teaching different kinds of learners, who really know writing at a particular grade level, is really helpful. And I would also say on the writing task end, it's allowed us to actually pilot new kinds of writing tasks pretty quickly with people who aren't already involved in the study, and in fact aren't even might be in similar communities but aren't even connected with the sites involved. So it allows for that independence.
Which, for folks who know writing assessment, know is a really important thing, because it's really hard to tell ahead of time whether a certain prompt is going to work or not. So that's the scoring part of it. Alix, tell us what infrastructure you had in place to get all these pieces of writing to the scoring session.
Yeah, and the logistics on that, I mean, I think it doesn't sound like a particularly complicated task. What makes it challenging is that we were literally doing these 2-day assessments for each student in 7th, 8th, and 9th grade in 44 districts across 10 states and 12 local writing project sites. And so there's an issue of volume. It's also a 2-year program, and so we needed to administer assessments to kids and be able to know where they were. At the end, and we did that in the fall of 2013, and we needed to know where they were in the spring of 2015 so we could get them the right assessment at that point in time. And we did have a huge infrastructure that had a couple of parts to it. One was that within each local place, there was a local site research coordinator who worked directly with the schools and districts to do things like schedule the testing dates and make sure the teachers got the right packets, so that we worked to distribute the different test tasks across kids, and so kids needed to get certain ones. And there was someone local who literally was in charge of making sure the right papers got to the right kids. And so that was one element of it. On the back end, when papers were at SRI, both in terms of printing and then when they came back from those local places, there was a huge database and scanning system set up so that we could go through and track the papers and then sample them appropriately. Because needless to say, we were not, with the goal of understanding whether this program was impacting the districts participating, we were not scoring each and every piece of paper. That would have been absolutely cost prohibitive. We still scored an incredible number of papers. 120 times 44 districts papers were scored, which is a lot of papers. But we needed to find them and then do things to protect students' rights as subjects of research, and go through and strip identifying information and make sure that they were prepared for scoring in such a way that the scorers were blind to the time that the assessment was done. Is this a pre-test? Is it a post-test? The place, treatment and control. And so there's an absolutely massive logistical task that we have very smart database people and very careful people doing very, very detailed work to pull off. But it's I think, going back to that initial point you made about the challenges in large-scale evaluations, is sometimes you need a lot of people with really, really precise attention to teeny, tiny details, because if any of those details goes wrong, you might have scored a paper, and if if the label falls off, you suddenly can't link the writing you've so carefully gathered and scored into the right place in your statistical model. So it's a huge complex task to do something that sounds in some ways so simple. Well, you just test the kids, but to do it accurately is a real bear.
Requires a big infrastructure. Well, let's zoom back out, Elise, because we skipped over a really important point, which is sort of your overall design, and in particular, how do you do this random assignment thing for people who've never done it?
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about the overall design.
Sure. And so I think one of the places to start is the fact that the National Writing Project put out a call for sites interested in doing this work. And among the things that the call did was say, hey, it's going to focus on argument writing, and there's going to be a randomized controlled trial as part of it. And that's really important as a starting point, which is to help people understand, if they're going to participate in these types of studies, that it is a randomized controlled trial, to understand why, and to really, it sounds like a conversation that no researcher recruiting someone would want to have, but as I've done several of these now, I've come to really believe that it's important for anyone who's going to participate in a randomized controlled trial at any level to, prior to actually starting the study, to really take a long, hard look at what this means. This means you're committing to do a program that, in this case, we're asking that the 7th through 10th grade language arts teachers across the district, that at least 80% of them would get 90 hours of professional development over 2 years. And so districts that were going to get recruited by the sites needed to know that actually their teachers were going to be asked to do a lot, and they needed to be able to support that. And the sites, which were used to getting to offer professional development to everyone who was interested, so long as they had capacity, needed to make peace up front with the fact that they were going to work with half of the districts now, and we're going to have to ask the other districts to hold off for 2 years until the study ended to get work. And so there were a bunch of things that people needed to sort out in the recruitment process. But in terms of the randomization, so we got people interested. The National Writing Project picked 12 sites because that was the amount of funding they had. They couldn't take everyone. And then those sites went out and recruited districts, explaining the program, explaining the study. And we ended up with 44 districts, and we did something called blocking, which is a technical term that just means that, we had schools in Mississippi and New York and Arizona and 7 other states, and they're not all the same. And in fact, even within states in different regions, there were different sites working with the districts. And so randomization guarantees you that there won't be a bias for the treatment or control group, but it doesn't actually say anything about whether they're going to be equivalent at the start. You could flip a coin 10 times and get heads 10 times. And so one of the things you can do to minimize the risk of imbalance with randomization is to set up groups that are more similar and randomize within those groups. And so we asked sites to recruit pairs of districts that we said, please make them similar. And we gave some guidelines around it. They had to meet certain federal requirements for the funding around being high needs rural districts. And then we randomized one pair at a time to make sure that all the districts from Mississippi didn't end up in the treatment group versus all the districts in New York in the control or anything like that. So we block randomized, and literally we used online software. I believe it's www.random.org to do coin flips and assign districts to treatment or control. So that's how the randomization thing worked.
And what kind of responses did you get in recruiting? Like, what are some of the questions that come back, and how do you answer those for people?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that people tend to ask is about the ethics of this. And you mentioned some of these issues at the start. One of the things that we would say in this case is, the National Writing Project does not have the capacity to serve all 44 districts at the same time. It's a very true statement. And actually, in that case, you have two districts saying, oh, I'd like to work with you. Oh, I'd like to work with you. You either have to choose a favorite, or you can flip a coin. And there are ways that actually the coin flip is more fair. And so I think that's, in a case where you have limited resources and something is oversubscribed, I think the combination of doing this completely randomly and ensuring that the other district can access this, a one-year version of the program in this case, when the study was over, I think was completely fair. And so we explained that.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think a lot of people only focus on the negatives of the ethics, but in fact it's this incredible fair way to handle this limited resource situation in a lot of times. Yep. Elise, you've mentioned a couple of times the qualitative data, the implementation data. Can you speak a little bit more specifically about the kinds of things that you looked for and what methods you used to look for them in the implementation?
Sure. So we actually looked at a few different things. One is the implementation of the program, which we defined as the local writing project sites delivering the PD that they kind of promised to deliver. And the way we understood that was collecting records from the professional development providers of who showed up and specific things about what was covered in their professional development, whether people were getting the hours that they were supposed to get. We also looked at, so this design, one set of districts was randomly assigned to get the College Ready Writers program, and the other set of districts was randomly assigned to do business as usual in compliance with whatever their state was already doing around the adoption of new standards. And especially in New York State, the state developed a whole website called Engage New York that developed curricular materials, and local regional education agencies were rolling out professional development and things to help teachers make these shifts. So we thought it was really important to understand what the teachers in the control group, as well as the teachers in the program group, were getting. So we measured the treatment and control contrast, which is what that's called, via teacher surveys. We also looked at the instruction going on in teachers' classrooms and used instructional logs and teacher surveys to be able to compare the instruction in the program classes versus the control classes. And on the teacher survey for the teachers getting the College Ready Writers program only, we also asked specific questions about program materials, which ones they used, how much, so we can go back and make statements like 93% of teachers in CRWP districts reported using at least one of the mini units that was developed, and 93%, I believe, reported uploading their student assessment, their formative assessment data into the system. We wanted to know that about teacher uptake. And then there were the qualitative data where we went out and did site visits and got a read on teachers' experiences with the program. But we really worked to measure all of the parts of if you think about the causal chain you have here, there's professional development. Was it delivered? Did teachers take it up? Did it change their practice? And did those things in turn impact students? We tried to measure across that whole spectrum.
That's great. I'm going to actually turn to this point in the session when I usually ask the team that I'm interviewing to pose a challenge to the group, We have a bunch of folks who are taking this course online, my students at CU who are watching these videos and can respond. Tell us a little bit about a challenge that you're facing right now in your work together that people taking this course might be able to help you out with or think with and give you some ideas.
Do you want to go first, Linda? I'm trying to think about what it's. If you'd asked this question when we were in the middle of the study, I think it might be easier. So I'm wondering, we're about to launch another study where the challenge is, I'm wondering about shifting there.
That's what I was thinking too, Elise.
Okay. Do you want to go first? Or you want me to?
Either way. I can go. I'll go first. So the new study is to really look at a one-year version of the College Ready Writers program and to see whether that can also have impacts on teacher practice and student learning, because we would really like this to be something that is much more widely accessible. It's really hard for schools and districts to commit to this level of engagement for 2 years. So we have a genuine question about that. We also wanted to use somewhat fewer evaluation resources. So we have a pretty interesting research design, which Alix can talk a little bit more about. But I think that one of the core challenges that we are thinking about is becoming really clear about that treatment control contrast in teachers' practice and how we get enough information that can be quantified and ways to track what's really happening in teachers' practice to see what is changing in the treatment condition and what business as usual really looks like. So Alix, you should probably talk a little bit about the design.
Yeah. So the design is that we are hoping to recruit 24 to 30 teachers in middle school and have them select 2 similar classes, and we would randomly assign one of them to get the College Ready Writers program, 1-year program, and the other to not. And I think this is in some ways it requires a real shift in thinking of the National Writing Project as a professional development organization, because professional development tends to work by changing teacher knowledge and then skills, and here the teacher who is teaching the control students is getting the professional development. So the fundamental challenge is really just making sure that we have an understanding of what's being tested here, which I think is the extent to which the curricular resources and formative assessment tool can accelerate change in instructional practice, because that is being connected to teacher knowledge, but it's that acceleration. It's kind of how this program works, and if it works in a year that's being tested. So I think that and really thinking about how do we measure the differences in instruction that kids in those 2 classes are getting, I think that's the big challenge that we're facing right now.
Oh, great. So I invite folks online and in the class to add their thoughts about what's reasonable to expect in this more focused study, and one in which everyone is getting the professional development, but some of the key differences are the resources. So anyone this week can respond to those challenges, and that discussion is going to be happening on the forum for the course. The URL for that is forum.dml.hub.net. And you can also continue this conversation from today using the Twitter hashtag #CLEval. As much as possible, please, when you make your comments, try to add something to something someone else has written. Let's get a conversation going on these threads. We've done a great job so far in building on one another's ideas, and I'll be sure to pass on your ideas to these 2 wonderful guests. So thank you, Alix and Linda, for joining. And our next webinar will be Monday, April 4th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We're going to have 3 guests who are all expert in out-of-school evaluation. Mark St. John of Inverness Research Associates, Vera Michalchuk of Stanford University, and Jim Diamond of EDC's Center for Children and Technology. And there our focus is going to be on reporting and using evidence from evaluation of out-of-school learning programs. Thank you for joining today, and I hope you can join next time. Thanks, Alix and Linda.